Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Texas Tribune TribCast for Tuesday, November 11th. I'm Eleanor Klibanoff, law and politics reporter at the Texas Tribune, joined this week by special guest host, politics reporter Alejandro Serrano.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Matthew will be back with us next week. And just for a bit of housekeeping, next week's episode will not be on YouTube because it will be coming at you from the Texas Tribune TribFest, where we will be recording audio. You can get it where you get your podcast audio usually, but we will not be on YouTube. We will come back to YouTube the week after. And that is a panel with, or a TribCast conversation with former House Speaker Dade Phelan. So if you don't want to miss that conversation and many other important conversations, make sure you join us at TribFest later this week. But that's not what we're here to talk about.
It's not.
Alejandro, a few weeks ago, you and our colleague Kayla Guo reported on a very Texas political episode, a this could only happen in Texas sort of situation relating to the governance of the Alamo Historic Site.
Yeah. A lot of people have feelings about the Alamo, and a lot of people care about the Alamo. And we saw this growing outrage start with sort of a social media post escalate sort of perpetually, very exponentially quickly. And then the lieutenant governor called for the firing of the president who oversees the board that manages the Alamo. And today, that former leader is here with us today, Kate Rogers. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, welcome to the TribCast. Before we get into all the brouhaha, which we're going to sort of unpack for people who either, didn't follow that or sort of forget the details of it. But to start off, what is the Alamo Trust? What was your role there?
Certainly. So the Alamo Trust is a nonprofit organization that is contracted by the state of Texas via the Texas General Land Office to oversee the daily operations of the Alamo, but also to implement and realize the $550 million Alamo plan, which is the redevelopment effort that is currently underway on the grounds.
How long did you work there? Because you were recently president, but you've been overseeing this for several years now, right?
Yeah, so I was brought on in the spring of 2021. So about 4.5 years I was there.
And what's your background?
Interestingly, I'm not a historian by training. I'm passionate. My personal passion is around education because I am the granddaughter, and sister of Texas public school educators. So education has kind of always been a thing for me. So I spent most of my career at HEB, actually, at the company. For 18 years, my last post was Vice President of Communications and Culture at HEB. Then I left the company and I went to go work for Charles Butt for several years, helping him with some of his activities, including the Holsworth Center that support public school leaders and public school teachers, and then got called by a recruiter sort of out of the blue about this position at the Alamo. Didn't know, to your question earlier, that the trust was even an entity at that time.
Wow.
I mean, HEB, the fourth branch of the Texas government, as we consider it.
For sure, especially when it comes to disaster relief, right?
Yes.
Nobody does it better than HEB, that's for sure.
What drew you to the job?
A few things, right? I really was attracted by the board, just a great group of people. My interview with them was really wonderful. And then I went down to the grounds to visit, and for many years there's been talk of doing something with the Alamo in San Antonio. Sometimes visitors would come and they would say something like, "Is that it?" Or "I thought it would be much bigger." So there's often been this sentiment, not by all, but by some, that the visit itself was somewhat underwhelming. And so there's been multiple versions of this thing we call the Alamo Plan that have been advanced over the years. This one that is currently being implemented is the only one that has successfully garnered strong support from the city of San Antonio, Bexar County, and the state of Texas. And the state of Texas, obviously, the biggest contributor to the project.
When you took that job, did you sort of understand the fights that were going on around the Alamo? And if you had to characterize that, what is the conflict we are still having over the Alamo?
So I don't think there's any way to actually know the complexity of the work unless you're working there. So I knew what I read in the paper because right before I came on board, sort of at the end of 2020, there was a big brouhaha because the prior plan Ironically, today, on this very day, they're reopening the cenotaph, which is the monument to the Alamo defenders. And many years ago or so, before I came on, there was a plan that called for moving the cenotaph from the battlefield sort of down the street in front of the Menger Hotel, and very controversial. It was voted down by the Texas Historic Commission, and pretty much there was a complete reset of the project called for by the mayor of San Antonio at the time. So there were new players put in position at the board level, at the staff level. Enter Kate Rogers, and I honestly did not fully understand. I don't think there's any way you could.
I mean, this has been sort of bubbling up for so long in various ways. I mean, what is the issue here, right? It's about how we teach the history of the Alamo, which is so central to Texas's history, but has gotten what is the conflict here?
I think there's multiple sources of conflict, right? So one of those is the fact that the property itself is co-owned by the city of San Antonio and the state of Texas. So why do I bring up this idea of consensus between the county, the city, et cetera? So the first step in getting any of this done was a lease agreement that needed to be negotiated between the city and the state, because the state owns the Alamo Church and the Long Barrack, the two most important artifacts, and the grounds behind it. But everything sort of to the west of that, Alamo Plaza included, is actually owned by the city of San Antonio. So in order to get this plan moving forward, the two had to agree. And politically, that's not always the case, right? You have a very conservative leadership at the state level, very blue leadership at the city level. And so, it took a lot of brokering to get everybody to come to the table and agree that this was the right path forward. So I think that's one thing. The other thing that you mentioned, Alejandro, is it's not that we don't love the Alamo, it's that we love the Alamo too much. So there's so many opinions about what should be done, what shouldn't be done. And yes, that relates to the story that will be told, but it also relates to the physical space itself. Some people would say, is this even needed? Why just leave it alone? Why even undertake this massive project? Other side of the spectrum would say, take it all the way back, bring back the original battlefield and its original footprint, which would have been 2 feet lower than where it is now. So there's just very strong views on all sides about all things, including the cenotaph, obviously. Then you have the narrative. And, let's face it, we're living in an interesting time right now, not just in Texas, but across the country in how we interpret our history. And the idea, and again, the partnership between the city and the state actually calls for the lease agreement itself. It calls for telling the full history of the site. Most people, the Alamo gets somewhere around 1.6 million visitors a year. Most people are coming because they know about the Battle of 1836. It's, no one would argue that's the most important event that happened on the site. And it's the reason that most people come. They want to learn more about it. They've, either watched a movie or read a book. They know about Davy Crockett and they want to kind of unpack what happened there. But a lot of people don't know that it was actually a Spanish mission. It was the first of the 5 missions in San Antonio. And so there's just this great opportunity to teach people about the full history, what happened before the battle and what happened after, while still keeping the battle as the central focal point.
Thank you for that reflection. We certainly want to get to all you accomplished. And, in reading about you, it's interesting how, you often would have press releases and conferences where you were celebrated for some of the things that you did in the last couple of years. But, to get to the last component, you're talking about the narrative. There was one thing in particular that sparked a whole new wave of backlash and narrative, and it's this post on Indigenous Peoples Day. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us more about that? It wasn't the first time the Alamo posted this post on social media, but this year it exploded.
It did. Yes, to your point, for the last couple of years, there's been a post that reflects sort of all the things that are represented on that specific day. One, representing Indigenous peoples. Why would the Alamo post about Indigenous peoples? The Alamo itself, the structure was actually built by Indigenous hands. So, it was a mission There were people being converted in the mission, and the people who were actually doing the labor were of indigenous descent. At the same time, we would normally post a Happy Columbus Day. Again, yes, Italian explorer, but also funded by the Spanish crown to come to explore what we know today as America, right? Even though he never technically got here. But that's beside the point. But given the rich history and the relationship between Spain and the Alamo, and also the local American Indian tribes or Native American, or whatever you want to call them, it sort of made sense that we would honor both.
Did you expect any backlash to making an Indigenous Peoples Day post?
No.
What were you doing? Can you take us to that moment?
Well, I wasn't
what?
even, let's be clear, I wasn't even in San Antonio when that, so, like most organizations, there's a calendar by which things are posted.
You're not tweeting as the CEO
So no,
of the trust.
I was not the person who was actually putting the post up. And I think that the communications director was just following what he'd done for the past several years. And none of us were, shame on us. We're monitoring at the federal level changes within the administration and calls for not the elimination of Indigenous Peoples Day, but to really celebrate Columbus's contributions to the country. And so I think he thought he was doing the right thing by posting both. I went to undergraduate at TCU. I was at TCU to give a lecture on the Alamo in their public history department. And so, I got this phone call. We took the post down, tried to do damage control, obviously unsuccessfully.
And we should say Land Commissioner Don Buckingham, who has jurisdiction over the Alamo, had sort of tweeted, "Woke has no place at the Alamo," and announced an investigation into this tweet, and then started, blasting off an email to her supporters. Like, this really became certainly, at least the way it was being portrayed in the story, is like sort of Don Buckingham versus, the woke Alamo. Just from that individual experience, I mean, what do you see as like the full picture there? Like, what was being missed in that retelling of how that went down?
I don't know that there's anything being missed. I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory because it was also public, right? These are posts on social media and tweets about, what one side believes and what, versus the other. In my view, woke is it's a term, it's a political term that is, thrown around a lot in today's world to describe any number of activities. I think everything we did at the Alamo, or I did at the Alamo, there was no movement, if you will, to not honor the men who fought and died there. That was definitely not something that was underway. In the new Visitor Center Museum, the largest gallery is dedicated to the battle. The interesting thing about it is that, this narrative that's been being developed to inform all the exhibits and so forth, that's been going on for, a few years. So it was interesting that this all the sudden became this flashpoint, that all of a sudden it's woke.
Right.
And was it just that, or do you think there was more to it? Like, I think you said in another interview, it's the $1 million question, whether this post was really it. But what was your relationship like with, state leaders and your colleagues? Like, what were there tensions? Like, what was the lead up to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think at times there were tensions, not so much with the lieutenant governor's office, but the general land office in particular is exceptionally involved in the project and, wants to have a lot of involvement in many of the daily decisions that are made there.
How did that play out? Like, how did that work with you? Was there conflict over that?
I wouldn't say there was ever outright conflict. There were rumors, but that's hearsay. I don't know that. Rumors that the commissioner was not a fan of mine. We never had an exchange, a conflict, an altercation, anything of that nature. But there were, buzz out there that, she's not a fan of yours.
So this bubbles over a couple days, and then the next flashpoint is the lieutenant governor's letter that I mentioned at the beginning of the
Yes.
podcast. And when he quoted your dissertation, he quoted like a couple like
Yes.
sentences from I think it's very long. I speed read it.
As most dissertations are.
Yes.
Very,
Yes.
very long and very boring, Alejandro.
But I want you to tell us about it and why you decided to go down that path of inquiry. Because reading it in hindsight, it seems like some of the things you wrote about and believed in, you kind of accomplished. Especially when it came to like treating the historical site as a place where teachers and students can really learn and kind of engage with their history.
Yeah, I mean, it might be woke on my part. I've never considered myself woke, right? I'm a member of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. I'm a descendant of the original Canary Island family, one of them that settled San Antonio in 1731. My dad was a West Point graduate who served 5 tours in Vietnam. I've never considered myself woke. So it's interesting to have that label placed upon me.
Definitely Texan.
Texan through and through, for sure. And so it was a great honor to be at the Alamo. So I'm not 100% sure how, that characterization got made.
How did you come to write to just walk us through the dissertation? Like, what is it?
For anyone who's ever written a dissertation, you know that the selection of a topic can be a very arduous process because it has to be something so specific that one person could actually tackle the research and write about it. So you start out with something really grand that you think is going to change the world, and you end up with this very, very, minor topic that you spend several years of your life writing and learning about. So mine was on the role of U.S. historic sites and museums in supporting social studies instruction in K-12 classrooms. So you have the intersection of my passion around education. I was getting a doctorate degree in global education at the University of Southern California. And so my research sites were Monticello, Mount Vernon, Gettysburg, and the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And I really thoroughly enjoyed the topic. And I was going to say earlier to your question, Alejandro, so one of the things that came out of that was I attended these multi-day professional development experiences for teachers that happen at these really well-known sites. And they're all expenses paid. Teachers can come, they can really stand in the place where history happened. They can interact with living historians who are Thomas Jefferson or George Washington. It's just a really special, meaningful experience. And so we started doing those at the Alamo. But one of them is actually to Mexico City for 5 days of professional development, a partnership with UNAM to really help teachers understand the connectedness between Mexican history and Texas history. For some, that might be considered woke. For the teachers, it was a really rewarding experience.
And it's also a Texas component, right? Where they do like also development in some of the battlefields here.
Yeah, so there's a Texas Revolution road trip where, again, to really understand the revolution in its entirety. So it starts at the Alamo and then moves on to Goliad, Washington on the Brazos, because, of course, the Constitution was being signed at the same time, and nobody knew what was happening at the Alamo versus the attendees at Washington on the Brazos. Then on to San Felipe de Austin, and then finally San Jacinto, on San Jacinto Day. So the teachers kind of get to walk in the footsteps of those who fought all of those battles as part of the revolution.
Yeah, and part of it, I don't know if you have objection to me reading, but, kind of it is like you were really candid in some of these views, and this was years ago. Like, at one point...
Apparently too candid.
Wait, I'm sorry, and just for clarity, this dissertation was written while you were working at the...
Partially
at the Alamo.
Partially.
Yeah.
So, you have to remember that a dissertation is written over several years. And so part of it was written, I started the program before I got to the Alamo, and then part of it, yes, would have been written afterward. And as you're evolving and you're writing the various chapters, there's a lot of cutting and pasting of things you wrote before that's being, well, this belongs in this section or that section. And when this all came up, honestly, I had to go find my dissertation and read what I had written because I honestly couldn't remember. And I was thinking, what did I write that was so offensive? Because, again, if you've ever written a dissertation, you know that no one ever reads them other than your committee. So your audience for your dissertation is largely your committee. right? Your chair and the committee members. And for this in particular, my committee were faculty members at the University of Southern California who really have no visibility into politics in Texas. So I was trying to explain the environment to them was the point of the section that was pulled out.
And some of your views as well. Like, again, I just wanted to read
Yeah,
this
please,
for
yeah.
listeners. But he said, philosophically, I do not believe it is the role of politicians to determine what professional educators can or should teach in the classroom. Instead, teachers should be afforded the autonomy to make those decisions based on their own expertise as well as the needs of their students.
Which feels pretty straightforward, right? You're essentially saying politicians should not play a role in dictating sort of how this history is taught. Is that,
Yes,
did you consider that to be a controversial statement at the time?
obviously not.
Yeah.
But it's a different time, It was a few years ago. Things have changed. I don't think that some of the things that are happening today were happening then. I'm not the only person who's, been singled out in this fashion. It's happening in our universities. The president of A&M just recently. I think it is interesting that politicians who publicly support the right to free speech and actually argue for the right to free speech are sort of saying, well, but not when you write something that is potentially critical of something we believe.
Do you feel like that's hypocritical of them? Do you feel like there's this shift that you're talking about is sort of contradictory?
I think you can't be selective. If you stand for the First Amendment, right, and you stand for people's right to express their own views, their own opinions, even if they disagree with you, I don't think you can be selective in your defense of the First Amendment. You're either supportive of it or you're not.
In an op-ed, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick pulled out a part of your thesis in which you said the Alamo should be, quoting, a beacon for historical reconciliation. Do you still believe that that's sort of, is that how you would frame that today?
It's interesting because historical reconciliation is a academic term, right? So, look, there are all sorts of boogeyman things that are quoted in my dissertation. One of them, the Forget the Alamo book. I'm not suggesting that I was a fan or am today a fan of the Forget the Alamo book. I was trying to explain that it came out right when I got there, and it created all of this controversy. That was the only reason for bringing it up. What did you ask me?
I think that, like, just sort of, do you stand by the idea that it should be a beacon for historical reconciliation?
Yeah, so at that time, I also mentioned critical race theory, which is also a big flashpoint. The thing for me, as a person writing a dissertation, most of us, in my experience, I went to school, public schools in Texas. I didn't learn about theoretical frameworks until I was working on my doctoral degree, where you're sort of searching for a framework around which your research will be based, right? So Kolb's experiential learning theory, or some of my classmates would use critical race theory. But I never experienced in my public school years that theoretical frameworks were even a part of K-12 education. But it became this big thing, sort of similar to the term woke. It's a label that has become more of a political term, in my view, to say, I don't agree with this person. You're this, you're that. So I'm sure that's what was in my head when I was writing this. Again, I had to go back and look at what I had written, because once you're done with that thing, everyone knows the best kind of dissertation is a done dissertation. And you put the thing on your shelf and probably never to be heard from again. The fascinating thing, so there's two things I want to say. A is I have been overwhelmed by the number of people who have reached out to offer their support. Letters to the editor in San Antonio, friends I haven't talked to since high school who read about this. And there's a lot of, concern, sometimes anger, that this was not a fair thing. Not for me to decide that, obviously. But I've also been floored how many people have said, well, I read your dissertation. And I thought, you did? And they'll say, yeah, I read it. And I didn't really see what was so offensive about it. I talked to one reporter who said, it's not even about the Alamo. And I said, I know, it's not. But for whatever reason, it became a very offensive thing.
Before 3 weeks ago, had anyone read it? Had you received any pushback, especially in professional?
No, I've never even had. Because sometimes the only time someone might reference your dissertation is someone who is doing research on a similar topic, right? And then they'll reach out to the researcher to say, hey, I'm working on a similar paper, and they may have a question for you. But I've never even had that. I've never had anyone mention it. So it does, the $1 million question about how all of this transpired. Also, who went and found it and why?
And do you know who flagged this to
No.
the lieutenant governor?
I do not.
How did you reach the decision to resign? I mean, walk us through that experience.
Well, I was asked to resign.
And you just like...
I didn't want to be a distraction to the project.
Like in that moment, you were asked to resign, essentially being told, like, the implication there being you'll be fired, which you're not going to get to that point in all likelihood. So, like, what was that experience of getting that, like, order, more or less, and how did you come to, like, yes, it's time?
Well, I was obviously very upset. I really loved my job at the Alamo, and I felt like we were doing good work. So this wasn't anything based on my performance per se, right? So technically, even though the General Land Office is really the one overseeing everything at the project, technically I reported to the board, 2 boards of the trust and the Alamo Foundation. And by all accounts, all of my reviews and evaluations were always very positive. I was promoted in September. I had a very positive review by the board in June. So it was a bit of a shock, and it all happened so fast, within 24 hours. We found your dissertation, the language is very concerning. And I think here's the part that I can understand why they said that you just can't do this job, because it sounded like I was being critical of the legislature in what I wrote, and the legislature is the largest donor. They're the funder of the project. And so I could see how we can't have someone running this project who sounds ungrateful or critical of the largest donor to the project. So that part I understood. It just all happened so fast. So I really didn't have a lot of time to process what was happening. Because there was, we found your dissertation the next morning, you need to resign. Now it's on X, and I really was just reeling from the whole experience because it was so sudden.
At the beginning of the conversation, when we were talking about Indigenous Peoples Day posts, you mentioned something about how maybe you or others could have paid more attention to the federal government.
Yes.
You also mentioned, when I was about to read the passage, that perhaps you were too candid. Do you have regrets through any of this? Like, how do you feel now?
That's a great question. And it probably changes a little bit every day. I feel like this week I'm just now kind of getting my feet under me and starting to think about the future and what I'm going to do next and how I can still contribute and so forth. Of course, when this all came out, I thought, well, gosh, I wish I hadn't written that. But I went back and read it, and it probably was what was in my heart at the time. I didn't really know the lieutenant governor well before I took this project on. Never had a, tense working relationship with him. I found him to be very supportive and his love of the Alamo to be quite genuine. So like I said, for me, it was mostly just a huge surprise and very upsetting.
Do you still believe some of the things you've written?
I do believe that teachers should be treated like professionals. I do. I mean, how could I not? I mean, my older sister, is now in administration, but one of the finest educators I've ever known. And given my background, I think it's one of the hardest jobs that anyone can possibly have because it requires so much patience and creativity and How are you going to bring an individual topic to life to, spark curiosity in all these very diverse young people? And it's becoming a harder job in today's world. So I obviously have a bias towards, not over prescribing what teachers can and should do in the classroom. But that's a personal bias that I acknowledge, and not everyone feels that way.
And I mean, we've alluded to like things have changed, things are shifting, our political moment is changing, all of that. I mean, as someone who was sort of inside the government to a certain extent, I mean, how do you feel like that shift in Texas has impacted things like, who gets to keep their job, how we tell history? I mean, have you felt that shift even since you joined in 2021?
Yes, for sure. I felt it. And I think, moving forward over the evolution of the script and ultimately what goes on the text panels in the new museum, there will be continued debate over that. As I mentioned, there is a document that was created by what was called the Alamo Citizens Advisory Committee, which was people appointed by city council members in San Antonio to create this document called the Vision and Guiding Principles. And it was a very high-level document, but basically to maintain a commitment to telling all the stories of the Alamo, not shying away from those topics that can be uncomfortable, like what was the role of slavery in the Texas Revolution? How will they tackle that? I don't know the answer to that, obviously, but I strongly feel there will be continued debate over it. I was having a conversation on the way up here. Like I said, I've just been floored by the number of people who have reached out. And this was a person who's a major donor to many things in San Antonio and beyond. And they're very involved in higher education. And, he was sort of saying, like, it'll be interesting to see how all this happens, because while, you have politicians now wanting to sort of say what can and should be talked about on our college campuses, private donors don't necessarily feel that way. Now, whether they have a big enough voice with the dollars they contribute to actually make a difference, I don't know. I think people are scared. I'm older, obviously, than the two of you, but I didn't live through the McCarthy era in this country. This felt like a little bit of a witch hunt to me. That's scary. This is the United States of America. We're not supposed to do things like that. We read about things like that happened in other places, but that's not supposed to happen here.
And were you ever scared during your tenure? Did you ever think, like, I'm kind of overseeing this massive project? It's kind of like a minefield, politically speaking, because a lot of people have strong feelings about it. Like, did it ever occur to you, like, I could be targeted one day?
Well,
like,
clearly, I wrote it in my dissertation. Not really, because I always felt like I had the strong support of the board. So I really didn't see myself as that vulnerable, but obviously I was wrong.
You talk about, I mean, the fear of, politicization, fear that people feel like they could lose their job over things like this. There's obviously some degree of fear on the other side, right? What do you think, what is your sense of why some of our elected officials are so fearful of other parts of this story being told or the battle not being centered? Like, what is your understanding of what the concern is there?
I think that's a very good question, because in my job, I saw the extremes on both sides. And, I will say, so presentism is a very dangerous thing, in my view. This is just Kate's opinion. But that means placing values of people living here in America in 2025 on men who lived a couple hundred years ago. They were men of their time. They were flawed. We're all flawed. But doesn't diminish the contributions that they made. And I feel very strongly about that. I mean, I think, we can embrace Thomas Jefferson, for example, and all of his complexity. The same with George Washington. We don't have to take away one person's history in order to bring forward the stories of people that are lesser known. So one big flashpoint that I think, speaks to that is around the role of slavery in the Texas Revolution. I think it was a factor in Texas in 1836. The truth is, slavery was a pretty small, especially chattel slavery, a pretty small institution in Texas at the time of the Revolution. It grew exponentially after the Revolution. Were all 189 men inside the Alamo fighting for exactly the same thing? I don't know how you could possibly say that, because you don't know what was in their hearts and minds. And there were known abolitionists inside the Alamo, as well as William B. Travis, who brought a slave with him. So it was more complicated. What I find troubling is that there seems to be no room for nuance in history. It's either this or that, right? You're good or you're bad. And that's problematic, because even at that time in Texas and Mexico, views about slavery were changing dramatically about, how these men ended up here and how they were going to make a viable economy in this state that both Spain and Mexico had been unsuccessful in settling prior to the arrival of the Texians.
Yeah, I think the lack of nuance, and I think you could argue that is happening on both sides. Like, that's not,
I
one
agree.
political party does not own lack of nuance,
Yeah.
for sure. But is sort of at the root of a lot of this, it seems like.
And I agree with you 100% that history is, Winston Churchill said it. History is messy. It's complicated. But he also said you have to know it in order to lead, in order to ensure a brighter future for any country. But it is messy, right? But I think what people are afraid of is that you're somehow going to suggest that the men who laid it all on the line, they lost their lives for what they believed in. That you're going to somehow suggest that they didn't have courage, or they weren't brave in that moment. I don't think you have to do that to also talk about what was happening around views on slavery at that time. You see what I'm saying? You can still be brave in 1836 in Texas and a proud Alamo defender, and also think that in order to develop Texas, cotton has got to be a part of it.
And it sounds like you're saying, like, people who come to the Alamo can sit with that. You sort of believe that people who come here can sit with that reality that these people did this, very noble thing, and also had a complicated backstory for the time, or not even for the time.
I think people can. And that's the role of museums. Museums are considered a very credible institution in this country, more than elected officials or politicians. They are trusted more than the government. So you have a huge responsibility, but your responsibility is not to judge or to tell the visitor what to think. Your responsibility is to present the information in a very factual and compelling way and let the visitor make their own decisions. Because every visitor brings to the Alamo their own set of values, their own past experiences, their own personal history, and all that is going to play into how they experience it. What I wanted was for everybody to be able to see themselves in the story of the Alamo. And I think a lot of museums try to accomplish that.
Do you think anything you accomplished in your tenure got closer to that?
I'm very proud of the work that we did, especially around our education programming.
A new center, right, for students?
The new education center, which, by the way, wasn't even paid for by the state. That was all private dollars that were raised. And yes, the state is the largest and most generous donor. None of this would be happening without that, without the lieutenant governor, without the legislature. But my team and I did raise $90 million privately to support the project as well. And the Ed Center is 100% funded privately. And I hope that it remains a place where school children, have a place to call their own at the Alamo. Teachers can participate in robust programming. Social studies is such an important subject, but it's often overlooked because it's not tested in the early grades in our schools. But it's the subject where you're supposed to learn how to participate in a democracy.
So what comes next for you? What's sort of the next chapter?
Great question. Like I said, I think I've just, I sort of feel like I got, punched in the stomach. It took me a little while to get my breath back. I'm starting this week to kind of turn that corner and think about what's next. Obviously, I hope to continue my passion for serving the community, for making a difference, for leaving, the world a better place than it was when I got there. I like to build things. The complexity of this project did not scare me, and so who knows? Hopefully, there's God has a path for me out there.
Might you build a lawsuit related to to your?
I don't know about
transformation?
that.
Okay.
I don't know about that. I would like to look to the future rather than dwelling on the past or what happened to me. Other than, I think that people would be happier if I didn't talk about all of this. But I think it's important that we do talk about it, because if we don't, I think there's great risk there.
And kind of like to peel back the curtain, maybe we could end on this. It was interesting, but when you texted me, we had been communicating, trying to set this up, and the first interview fell apart. But then the second time, both times you texted me, I'm ready to speak out. What, on the final note, what does Kate Rogers want to say?
What do I want to say? I want to say, that I thoroughly enjoyed my time at the Alamo. I learned a lot. I deepened my own knowledge of Texas history. I got to work alongside a great team, accomplishing great things together. That's kind of a unique thing. You don't always get that in your professional life, where you just really have this team that jives and works well together, and you're taking on this big project. So that was very rewarding to me. Secondly, I do think that we all should not look the other way, that this is the U.S. and this is not China or Russia or any place else, and we're supposed to be able to say what we think. We're supposed to be able to disagree with one another. And I think it's important that we all pay attention to that, because I think, some big shifts in world history have happened when people chose to stay silent or to look the other way.
Kate Rogers, formerly of the Alamo Trust, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Alejandro, thank you as well. That is it for this week's episode of the TribCast. You can get all episodes wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube, except as a reminder, next week's episode, because we'll be later this week at TribFest. Make sure you can still get tickets if you're interested. Open Congress on Saturday is open to the public and free. Our producers are Rob and Chris, and we will see you next week.